Hey, hi, everybody. We're just going to give it a minute for folks to join. Hi, everybody. I think we are going to get started, um, get rolling here as we have more people join, but this is really great. Thank you so much for coming to our continuing legal education piece on data centers that I'm really excited about. This has been part of a series that we have done mostly based on energy and energy law. We have at least one more on June 30th about methane gas, but we might do one additional one about writing and drafting legislation. So keep your eyes open, ears open. And of course, if you're not an attorney, this also is going to be something that's really interesting as well, because data centers impact so much of what's going on in environment and energy right now. And just for folks, I'm Jen Walling, Executive Director at Illinois Environmental Council. I will be here and on the chat during this. Um, I'm very excited to introduce you to Brad Klein, who I've known for a very long time, and he is a managing attorney at Environmental Law and Policy Center, and just an expert in these energy and energy capacity issues. So he's going to talk to us about data centers. I'll let him introduce himself a little bit more. But I do think if you have questions, you can put it in the Q&A box or the chat. And then at the end, we will I will facilitate questions and answers. So again, Hannah will probably post in a few minutes. She put if you want CLE credit, we put the link in. We'll post that again shortly. Um, but please sign up during this before 1 p.m. and we'll get your certificate entered as soon as possible. But I will hand it over to Brad to talk about data centers and the future of clean energy.
Great. Thanks so much, Jen. Hi, everybody. Looking forward to this conversation. As Jen said, I'm Brad Klein. I'm a managing attorney at ELPC based in Chicago and working on clean energy policy across the Midwest. A lot of work before state public utility commissions, but really increasingly, we're seeing all of our work affected by the new load growth projections driven primarily by data centers. So I'm interested in I'm really looking forward to kind of digging into that with you. In this presentation, I'll start with just a little bit of background on um, background context in Illinois, a little bit of basics about data centers, then move into some risks and opportunities presented by load growth in the electric power sector, with some policy recommendations for Illinois to consider, and then talk a little bit more about some current events both in Illinois and in some neighboring states and other places in the country. And just sort of at the outset, the focus of this presentation is primarily on energy impacts. Data centers have other impacts to clean air and clean water, siting, local communities. I'll touch on those, but I won't spend a whole lot of time on those issues because I'm not an expert in those areas. But just because I'm not mentioning them doesn't mean those don't exist. It's really multifaceted challenges here. So let's get started. Um, just sort of as a background and kind of context setting. Illinois is a leader on clean energy. We're all familiar with CEJA. We're familiar with the goals of moving towards a 100% clean energy economy. But at the same time, we're seeing a boom in energy intensive development, really especially led by data centers, but other trends like electrification of buildings, electrification of transit, large industrial growth. And I think this load growth creates both opportunities and risks for our energy future. And then just as a fun aside, I asked Google Gemini, to create an image of the intersection of clean energy, data centers, and power plants, and this is what it generated. So I was responsible for contributing to the state's load growth a bit in preparing this presentation. Just a quick recap on CEJA. Set Illinois out there as a leader in decarbonizing the power sector. And top lines here for our purposes, 50% renewable energy goal by 2040, 100% carbon-free power by 2045. So that would include both renewable power and nuclear generation, along with a host of other, other improvements. Landmark bill, and we're working hard to implement it. We still have a long way to go to reach those goals. This is just the latest snapshot. This was from February 2025 from EIA. It shows power generation by source in Illinois. So you can see that renewables are growing, but they're still maybe around 15%, while we have gas and coal, around 30 to 35% or so, with nuclear representing about half of the generation in Illinois. So, over time, if we're going to hit CEJA's goals, we have to shrink these top two bars and backfill in more with renewables. And this is some important context too, just kind of putting CEJA in context with the times when it was adopted. We were, if you look at this is the history of electric growth in the United States, starting from 1920 to 2020, over the last approximately 100 years. Period of strong load growth every year for between 1940 and about 2000. But then, the tail end here between really shortly after 2000 to 2020 or so, it's flat. And that's really the time that all of our, many of our memories are and our work experience was during this period of flat growth, which wasn't representative of the vast majority of the country's history, but it really influenced how we thought about energy and the context in which CEJA was passed right at the tail end of this. In an era of flat growth, it was sort of easy to think about the development of new megawatts of renewables and storage sort of on a one-for-one basis, displacing fossil generation. And I think that now may be changing. But the key here in this graph attempts to show sort of some projections, and this slide was taken from a synapse analysis that was prepared for Illinois industrial customers in Illinois in April. And I think what my takeaway from this slide is sort of like nobody really knows where load growth is going. We have that historical demand that's flat, and then depending on whose analysis or projections you use, it could be wildly different in the future. We're at this sort of transition point where it's really hard, if we had a crystal ball, it's really hard to tell what the future holds. But, the discourse in the industry is really a lot about load growth. And we're hearing so much about it, but I think it's important to kind of take it with a grain of salt and recognize that right now it's pretty hard to predict where load is growing, where load is going. And the reason for that is the load growth projections we're seeing are heavily influenced by uncertainty about data center demand. Data centers, are growing rapidly, driven by the rise of artificial intelligence and a number of other tech innovations. But again, it's really hard to tell, looking into the future, how much and what the contribution is going to be from data centers. And this is a slide from the same report from Synapse, doing some different scenario planning on where load could be going from data centers. And if you look at the last slide, which is here, this is just overall electric load growth. And then here's the next slide that shows data center load growth. You can see the shape is very similar. So the data center load growth is really what's driving the uncertainty in overall load growth. We've got a much better handle on the other sectors. So this is just one more slide that shows how quickly these assumptions and sort of forecasts are changing. And this is from PJM. This is their long-term load forecast for the PJM zone, so ComEd zone within PJM. And the most important two lines here are the ones on the right, the blue and the green line. The blue line shows PJM's ComEd zone load forecast going out to the future in 2024. And you can see it sort of rising, but sort of in a moderate way. And then 1 year later, in 2025, PJM did the same forecast with the same methodology, and you have much more significant electric load growth projections. So, not only is the load growth uncertain, but from year to year, there's dramatic differences. So again, my takeaway from this is like nobody really knows right now, and things are really in flux. And as we think about policy, it's important to recognize that what we're trying to do is be prepared and get in front of some trends, but we really don't know exactly what those trends will look like. So let's dig in a little bit into the sources of this uncertainty in the data center sector. First, I think it's a pretty new industry with a lot of innovation and kind of a land rush right now. There's AI, nobody really heard of Chat GPT a couple years ago. And AI was sort of a science fiction, concept. And then all of a sudden, many of us are using it every day in our daily lives or at work. And so it's just really booming. And I think there's a recognition of that, but there's still a whole lot of speculation about how much compute power we're going to need to serve this industry. Um, in the meantime, so developers of data centers are out there speculating. They're trying to secure land rights. They're trying to, you know, um, get investments in place so that they could be prepared to serve what may be much more significant demand for this compute. But there's not a whole lot that's been built yet, and a lot of the planned facilities are still in review, and they don't have secure electric service agreements. And so this graph, I think, is helpful. This looks at ERCOT, and the queue, or the line of data center applicants for electric service. And if you the the two very small bars at the bottom are data centers that are actually energized today, the green, or the very almost invisible slice, data centers that are approved, but they're not yet operational. Everything else involves things that are in development, and some of it is under review, and some of it there haven't even been studies submitted yet. So overwhelmingly, the queue is we think a lot of those projects in there are speculative projects that may never be developed. So notwithstanding the uncertainty in this area, we do think there's going to be load growth from data centers, and reputable analysts are predicting some significant long-term growth. So I wanted to sort of close on that there is a whole lot of uncertainty, but we are likely to see growth. And this is from McKinsey in 2025, at least their estimate of long-term growth from data center power consumption. So we've kind of established um, the challenge, or the uncertainty and challenge of load growth. I want to kind of dig in a little bit just in some background on data centers themselves. And so, you know, what are data centers? Big buildings with lots and lots of servers in them. The servers and the chips used in modern data centers use a lot more power than, data centers have been around a long time, but I think that what's changing is that the data centers themselves are getting bigger, and the chips and the servers used in the data centers are getting more powerful, and with that, they're using a lot more energy. So used in many sectors of the economy, but increasingly being used for large language model training for artificial intelligence, or just for queries, like the one I used to generate the image at the beginning of this presentation. Um, they're showing up, it's not uniform across the country. There are sort of hotspots for data center development. The largest one and sort of most longstanding is in Northern Virginia, cluster there of lots of data centers. But really, Illinois is also showing up as a hotspot, along with Northern California and a few other places. Um, especially in sort of the northern part of Illinois, in the ComEd zone, we're seeing many proposals for new data centers and a lot of interest from the industry. I think it's hard to sort of describe and understand the amount of power that just one large hyperscale data center can use. This to me was a really big surprise. Even earlier this year, I read Ben Inskeep's testimony. He's an analyst from Citizens Action Coalition in Indiana. They had a rate case invol involving Indiana Michigan Power, and the forecast that I&M were proposing in that rate case were pretty shocking. And I'll just kind of read a couple things from Ben's testimony. Um, I&M in that case forecasted that a single 1,000 megawatt hyperscale data center would use 52% more electricity than all of I&M's 420,000 residential customers combined in 2023. So let's just think about that and the challenge for an electric utility like I&M. They've got 500,000 residential customers. They've been serving them. One data center shows up, one hyperscale data center uses 52% more electricity than all of the rest of those customers. So I&M you know, is projecting a handful of new hyperscale data centers um, in there that are looking to develop in the near future, and they are projecting that it would lead to a tripling of their electric sales by 2030 if those move forward. So pretty significant. And again, there's uncertainty about timing and scale and where some of these are going to show up, but they do use a whole lot of electricity, and that does create some challenges for utilities. Um, just a couple statistics from Illinois. Data center load in Illinois was about 7 million megawatt hours per year in 2023, which was about 6% of electricity consumed in the state, but it's growing, especially in the ComEd zone, as I mentioned. And ComEd is reporting that they have about 70 applications for large new data center projects to date, and those are, I think, projects that have all submitted like $1 million deposit. So there's some indication that they're serious. But if all of them were built, which all of them are not going to be built, but if all of them were, and you totaled them all up, it would result in a additional peak load of about 28 gigawatts of power, which is staggering, considering that ComEd's all-time peak load, which was set in 2011, was 23 gigawatts. So, it just kind of puts this in scale. Now, I want to, again, remind everybody that not all these are going to show up, and it's hard to know which will, but, ComEd is facing a huge pipeline. But the overwhelming majority, we believe, of the projects in that pipeline are sort of spec facilities that are, trying to secure a place in ComEd's queue. There's a small share that are probably the actually large hyperscale, data center companies. So let's move on to some of the what are the consequences of that, and what are some of the challenges and opportunities. So, one challenge is we're in a market, supply and demand. And as demand for power increases, if we don't get sufficient supply to meet that demand, the prices will go up. That's sort of economics 101. And we are seeing capacity market prices under pressure and increasing. In PJM, we've had a significant increase that's going to result in customers in the ComEd zone. These are residential customers in the ComEd zone paying about 10 or 15% more on their bills this summer. And even worse in MISO, we think bills are going to go up about 18 to 22% for the summer. And the kind of projections that I've seen predict that these market prices are going to stay high for a while until new generation, can be built and we can, solve some of the bottlenecks in the development queue for new wind, solar storage, and other things in these regions. So, what's causing those price increases? Well, at least the PJM market monitor thinks data center load growth is a factor, and if they said, in fact, the primary reason for these conditions. And this is from their report this month in June. So what do we need to do about customer prices? Um, the ICC in Illinois is responsible for ensuring that prices and rates for electric service are just and reasonable. And one of the core rate making principles, not just in Illinois, but in every state, is that the costs for power should be allocated, the cost to provide electric power should be allocated to the cost causers. And when the ICC and other state regulators engage in rate cases, that's one of the things they try to do. Allocate costs for new power generation and the cost of power supply to the class of customers that are causing those costs or demanding that power. But in Illinois, just like in many other states, we don't yet, our cost allocation methodologies haven't really caught up to our current events. And we don't have tariffs that apply specifically to extremely large load customers like data centers. We do have some industrial rates, but as you saw from that last from the data about that I&M situation, like an average industrial customer does not look like a hyperscale data center. And the scale of power needed is just entirely different. And some of the different criteria and conditions for providing that power are different. So until we catch up in our rate making, um, it's entirely possible and probably likely that existing rates will result in cross subsidies. In other words, all of us, residential and other commercial customers, paying for power needs in our own bills that are being caused by very extremely large loads. And there's a really good report on this if you're interested in this topic and want to geek out on some cost allocation stuff. But it's actually a very accessible report from Ari Pesco at Harvard, where he's described some of these challenges about rate making, and I've linked it here in the presentation. His conclusion is that absolutely under current rates, we have a lot of cross subsidies right now, and those should be corrected. So here's another challenge. These big power users, the grid isn't really designed at this time to serve these huge new electric loads at the scale and speed at which they're coming. So in order to serve much larger facilities and meet this demand, we're going to need to upgrade the grid. And that requires a lot of planning and investments in infrastructure. And if we don't have that planning, the grid could be at risk. We could have poor reliability. I was on a webinar yesterday where, there was concern. They were describing how several different large loads tripped off at the same time in a state, and there was risks that it could crash the grid. So we need a better planning process to try to address this. And if we don't address it, we're going to spend a whole lot of money on an electric power grid that, again, someone's going to need to pay for. And those investments, thinking back to the earlier slides here where that show, how much data center load is currently forecast. At the same time, a lot of it's uncertain, and we're not sure which ones are going to show up. If the utilities out there building infrastructure to try to serve that peak load forecast, but only a small amount of that actually shows up, all the costs are going to be stranded. And other customers are going to have to pay for it, which is a significant risk. So we need better planning to protect consumers. My hope is that we begin developing standardized load interconnection policies that try to get a better handle on ensuring that the projects that actually get energized and that the utility is building infrastructure for are actually going to show up to avoid that stranded cost phenomenon. So that's things like requiring applicants, data center applicants for electric power service to provide higher financial commitments to make it clear that they're serious, different fees and deposits, penalties if they withdraw after the utility begins construction, requiring evidence of site control, other evidence that they're not just speculative, but they're really serious and ready to put money down. And then some prohibition on the shopping around phenomenon where one single data center company might put in the same application for the same kind of facility in 3 or 4 different utility territories because they just want to try to find where they can get electric power service. That results in double counting and it contributes to the uncertainty in the overall load forecast. I'm hoping, we do this already on the generation side. So, if you want to build a new wind farm or solar farm, or you want to put solar panels on your roof, there are standard processes that you have to go through to ensure the safety and reliability of your project when it's connected to the electric grid. In Illinois, those are codified at Part 466 of the Illinois Administrative Code. And they've been really successful at streamlining the interconnection process, but we don't have those kinds of similar interconnection policies for load. We just have them for generation, and that's a gap we need to fix. And there's a report here that I recommend for folks interested in this topic. Just came out, and it's guidance and considerations for large load interconnections, and that includes recommendations both on the financial side but also on the technical side, like what kind of technical requirements should states be thinking about when the utilities are reviewing data center applications. So that brings us to a third challenge, which is we're going to need new generation if load increases, and is it going to be clean or dirty? And are we going to stay on track with our clean energy commitments, especially in places like Illinois that have really made strong commitments to decarbonize and to be leaders in the clean power transition. So if we don't keep up, we're at risk of having to backslide on our clean energy goals, and we're at risk of not making progress on climate change and continuing to have dirty power that's impacting people's health. So there are other environmental considerations here that need strong regulation, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, around clean air and clean water. The chips used in data centers create heat, and that heat has to be controlled and removed, dissipated, in order to make sure that they continue to work. And so that requires a lot of either air cooling or water cooling. A lot of data centers are moving towards liquid cooling now, so there's a lot of water use involved in that. We need policies to regulate smart use of water and making sure it's clean. And the load growth is also driving some renewed interest in nuclear power, especially small modular reactors. And you've seen announcements recently from several of the hyperscale tech companies around deals to begin developing new small modular nukes to power their facilities. So what can we do about this challenge, the kind of clean power challenge? We need to unclog the interconnection queues, I think, first and foremost, for new wind, solar, and other forms of generation in MISO and PJM. There's been delays, there's been a lot of problems getting new generation built. And as a result, that's contributing to the high prices in PJM and MISO, and it's contributing to this uncertainty about whether we're going to hit our clean power goals. So we need to fix that. There's been a lot of attention on that. I won't go into it too much in this presentation, but that's a key factor. And as we're creating state policy, I think to try to ensure clean generation, I think there are some criteria to keep in mind. One is the importance of when data centers are trying to secure new electric power to power their facilities. We need to make sure it's resulting in new build and not just sort of poaching or consuming power from existing facilities, because that doesn't help us with our capacity market prices. We need the data centers to be out there developing and procuring power from new and sort of additional generation. And it's also important that the generation that that we're building or that the data centers are purchasing from is matched to the times that the data center needs them. So it doesn't really help us if we're only procuring power that we're not. We need to be procuring power at the peak times when that are driving prices. So it's matching that both in terms of location, so it can be deliverable, but also the right times of day. So that's there's been a lot of discussion about a concept called co-location, and this was something that Constellation Energy has been pitching quite a bit over the last few years, which is highlighting the fact that Illinois has a lot of nuclear power, and at least right now we are a net exporter of electric power that goes into the market. So Constellation, as the owner of several of these nuclear plants, said, "Hey, why don't we put some data centers on site at the nuke plants and co-locate them at the plant and just feed that power directly into the data center?" Which in some ways there's some logic to that, right? Because we have the power at the nuke plants and we wouldn't have to build additional transmission infrastructure to carry the power from the generator to the nuke plant. But on the other hand, that power is going into the market right now, and all of the rest of the PJM customers are paying for the transmission and infrastructure and paying for the capacity. So if all we're doing is putting new generation co-located, I'm sorry, misspoke. If all we're doing is putting new load, new data centers co-located with existing generation, it doesn't help us with the capacity prices. We continue to reduce capacity, and it's not going to help us bring prices down. And also, it doesn't take into account that other customers have already paid for this infrastructure. So, I think co-location has a lot of merit in concept of trying to put as much new load right next to or at the same site as new generation, but the generation should be new and additional. It shouldn't be, in my view, it shouldn't be co-located with existing generation. There's been, a lot of development in this area. FERC has had a couple technical conferences looking at co-location where we expect to see some guidance from FERC coming out. And, Constellation and I think this was actually a Talon Energy of the Susquehanna nuclear plant in Pennsylvania announced a deal recently where instead of co-locating behind the meter, they're now moving to something that would be in front of the meter. And so I think the trend here is a recognition that this kind of behind the meter co-location with existing facilities is not the direction to go, and we're seeing a trend, towards this concept of additionality. Other things that we can do here, I'd say trying to encourage new grid technology, grid enhancing technology or GETs, and demand flexibility to reduce innovations that help us use the existing grid more efficiently, so that it minimizes the amount of new construction and investment we need to make in the grid. And then we need policies that are going to encourage large loads and to bring their own clean energy. And the acronym we've been tossing around is Beyonce, bring your own clean energy. The more we can facilitate, provide pathways for these customers to propose new generation and bring it to the table, either on site through distributed generation and storage on the campus itself, through load flexibility and the different ways to operate the facilities that bring down peaks, and then also by procuring power from the market, from new facilities, the better off we're going to be. It's going to help us put us in position to still meet our clean energy goals. So I'll move on to some just discussion of some current events before we get to discussion and questions. Data centers were a topic of conversation in Springfield over the past year. There was a working group that was, included representatives of the data center industry and environmental advocates and consumer advocates and others talking about like what can and should the state do, what should legislators do to try to um, uh, avoid, address some of the challenges I described earlier. And there there were sort of three things that were under discussion, three categories of policies under discussion. The first one was um, tariff policies for the Illinois Commerce Commission to implement that would try to protect consumers from the risk of stranded costs and more fairly allocate costs for electric service to the cost causers. I think that those provisions are likely to be adopted in the state um, by the Illinois Commerce Commission, either whether we have legislation or not. I think the ICC's got a mandate to try to address this. Legislation would be helpful to direct the ICC, on a timely way to address it. But there may be opportunities this year to work on this at the commission. The second category of issues in the energy omnibus were some protections for clean air and clean water and sort of local impacts. And the third dealt with how we make sure that we're staying on track with our clean energy goals in our RPS in Illinois. And that proposal um, uh, entailed, the kind of proposal on the table at the time was having the data center customers pay a fee um, to the Illinois Power Agency to have the state procure clean power on their behalf, or demonstrate that the data center was procuring clean power on their own and thereby reducing the level of the fee they had to pay to the state. That was sort of an extension of the state's self-direct RPS provisions. So that legislation did not move forward. The data center language was removed from the final bill, and then, as folks likely know, the final energy omnibus bill did not pass in the spring session, and all of these ideas are going to still be on the table and under consideration in future sessions, including potentially the fall veto session. Um, so they'll come back, and I think we've made progress and are in position, I think, to kind of take up some of these ideas again and maybe make some changes and improvements. So other events, I think this week we're anticipating ComEd to file a tariff with the Illinois Commerce Commission, and their tariff would create sort of a new customer class for large load customers, and it would capture sort of the big queue of data center customers that they are experiencing. And that the tariff would have some different provisions for, how the directing sort of how the utility should study um, the impacts of these large loads and how they would assign the cost of that study and then infrastructure investment to the large loads. So it would start um, trying to address the customer risk and stranded costs. And I think there's also likely to be some discussion of like how ComEd sorts out which of these projects in this very, very large queue are actually going to move forward. Right now, there's not a lot of guidance on, the 28 gigawatts of projects they've received. Like, how do they choose which one of those goes? Where do they start? And I think that this tariff finally will have some ideas on how to sort those out and maybe identifying some key projects that could move more into a fast lane for study and eventual interconnection. So I already mentioned a little, I'm moving to the next bullet, some of the discussion in Illinois. It's been just because we have a lot of nuclear power here, the state has been focal point for some of the discussions around co-location and how we use the nuclear power to serve new load. Um, just in the past couple weeks, Constellation announced a deal with Meta to procure the clean energy attributes from the Clinton nuclear plant and allocate them to new Meta data centers. That's been in the news and sort of interesting to follow. And then in Illinois, it's a state, Illinois is a state that has some of the leading sort of biometric information privacy protections. And that's been a concern for some of the data center companies and that are interested in investing here. So I think there's some discussion about like how do we best protect our own biometric data in this new economy, and I expect there'll be further kind of developments in that area. Um, Lots of activity in other states beyond Illinois. ELPC has been either involved in or tracking many of these cases. Um, they fall into two categories. One is just regulatory activity at the state PUCs. Um, Indiana, the case I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of litigation in Ohio involving AEP around a new data center tariff. We're involved in a new case with Consumers Energy in Michigan. Consumers has proposed a new tariff for large load customers. All of these deal with some of the cost allocation and consumer protection issues I mentioned earlier. Um, and I would say there are some best practices emerging from those cases that are worth following, and certainly something that I expect the Illinois Commerce Commission to take up and consider as the developments in other states as they evaluate ComEd's proposal this week. Other states have adopted legislation. Minnesota, just a couple of weeks ago, adopted some legislation addressing data centers. It directs the state's Public Utility Commission to establish a new rate class for large loads, and then requires some consideration of how the state can stay on track with its own clean energy goals. So a demonstration from the commission that in order to connect new large load, Excel will have to show that it's building or procuring sufficient clean power to keep the state on track for hitting its RPS goals. So some good guidance there for states like Illinois that also have clean power goals. And then, really pretty much every day, if you look in the trade press, there's another state that has filed a bill or passed a bill, or a utility that's filed a tariff to address this set of issues that's emerging all over the country. And at ELPC, we're trying to stay on top of these developments and kind of compile lists of best practices to inform, policy in our Midwest states. So with that, I see that we're almost at time for questions. So I'll just wrap with some big picture conclusions, and then we can get into questions and discussion, which, I think these are sort of from my perspective. I feel like artificial intelligence and cloud computing, offer a whole lot of benefits. There's some skepticism, around like, is it all this really needed? I think we're seeing more and more like this is going to affect our lives in many ways. But I think we need to shape this new industry with good regulation to make sure, environmental and consumer impacts are adequately regulated. So I feel like it's a both and. At least I don't think we put the genie back in the bottle. I think there's going to be lots of great societal um, benefits over the long term, and risks that we're going to have to be aware of, but we need strong regulation. This can't just be the Wild West and we need to get ahead of it. And this is the moment to do that, where there's just a lot of interest, but not yet a whole lot of development. And I think the goals of those policies, look, protect customers, internalize the costs, protect customers from the costs and risks associated with electric service, and keep us on track to hit our climate goals. And I think Illinois can be a leader here. We've got a governor that has been like vocally supportive of investment in new technology in the state, things like the quantum campus on the south side of Chicago, um, trying to attract data center development. There are some tax incentives in the state. The governor's been vocal that he views this as a good thing overall. Um, but it has to come with these strong regulations that facilitate clean and responsible data center growth. And I think that's consistent with the governor said and with what our legislators have said, and certainly with what the Illinois Commerce Commission, I think, has said and would value. And we do have a very strong commission in the state, and they've been real leaders. So I think we're well suited in Illinois geographically, and with the resources we have, and with our regulators and public officials to emerge from this uncertainty as a real leader in this area. So with that, I will stop talking and field questions. Jana, do you want to facilitate any of the questions, or should I just look in the chat? How would you like to handle it?
Oops, I was talking and I was on mute. So,
Oh,
yeah, so I think that the simplest, let's start with are the data centers related at all to Bitcoin mining, which is another.
yeah. Um, so there are a lot of different varieties of and use cases for the increased compute that is included in sort of this category of load growth. So Bitcoin mining is definitely a piece of the overall picture. And I don't have like precise statistics on this, so I'm going sort of anecdotally off of kind of what I've been absorbing. I think my sense is that the larger driver of load growth, and what we're projecting in sort of going forward is primarily going to be driven by the more hyperscaler artificial intelligence, you know, use case and less on the Bitcoin mining, although it still is a component. I think this is one where there's been a lot of concern about like the social value and the energy use and importance for us to look at closely. I don't think it's going to be a predominant driver of load growth going forward, though.
Thanks, Brad. Um, okay, we got that one. Early on, Elizabeth asked regarding pricing, seems like the more energy an entity uses, the more it should pay per kilowatt hour, or whatever is charged. So the other residents don't have to pay for their energy use. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you're thinking about that with residential compared to industrial users?
Yeah, um, I'm happy to, and it gets into some of the complexity of rate setting and cost allocation. So starting from the basic principle, I think that the causer of the cost should be responsible to pay the cost. I don't think that necessarily leads us to the rates having to be higher, so long as we're accurately setting a rate based on our projected consumption from that class. So stating that another way, um, the fact that the data centers use a whole lot of electricity and their power factor is relatively stable, which means that we don't see lots of big spikes up and down generally. If we can project how much power they're going to use and assign a rate to that large volume of power, that means the utility has a large amount of revenue, right? Lots of consumption per kilowatt hour times the rate means there's a lot of revenue, and that revenue can then be used by the utility to um, do to build the infrastructure, maintain the wires and poles, et cetera, for for that class of customers. So it's complex, and that's why we have these rate cases where there's a lot of technical evidence presented to the commission, and then the commission is going to ultimately makes decisions on rates based on those models. But I don't think it necessarily means they need to pay higher rates. We just need to be accurate in making sure that the load is stable and it's not speculative. Because if we're setting rates based on an assumption that load is going to be really high and the utility is going to recover that revenue over many years, over the life of those facilities, but actually only half of those data centers actually survive, and several of them, you know, fold up shop and leave, or some of them never get built, then the utility has spent a whole lot of money to build the infrastructure um, necessary to serve them, but they're not getting the revenue they expected. So where does that revenue come from? It's probably going to have to come from other customers. And that's the cross subsidy and risk that I described earlier, where the utility is going to get its revenue one way or the other. And so if we don't do this carefully and accurately, there's a risk that the rest of us will be stuck holding the bag.
Great. I think there's two questions that are kind of related here. One person asked what kind of permits federal, state, and local agencies might data centers need that practitioners should keep an eye out for. But I think, very much related in terms of an ongoing piece is what can we do for proposed data centers in our communities, ensure that customers aren't paying increased needs, they're not experiencing blackouts, that there's safe water consumption. And Amalia is asking because of the Southworks Quantum Center, um, which includes a data center and a quantum site. Um, yeah, how can we address those things and ensure that they are the best for communities if they are moving forward?
Yeah, it's a great question that illustrates the like many layers of kind of challenges and issues here with this in this area. So like as I described earlier, I primarily cover the electric power side of this. And, in that case, it's the Illinois Commerce Commission that's ultimately responsible for sort of protecting consumers and setting appropriate rates. So, you know, engaging, there are opportunities for, organizations and members of the public to engage in those proceedings. And they're sometimes difficult and arcane to do, but like that's the venue for the electric power and electric rate issues. Um, on the sort of local siting, zoning, permitting, different state agencies like Illinois EPA have jurisdiction over some of the air permitting. Things like diesel backup generators are going to require permits, water usage. And then there's, local zoning issues around the siting and community impact. And I think organizing within your community, around specific developments, whether it's Quantum Southworks or others, is really important to make sure communities have a voice in, you know, the the kind of local requirements that apply to an individual project.
Great, thank you. Um, okay, a question in the chat was, do the data center load growths include increased energy need to cool the centers given climate change induce increased heat or cold?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think um, as I do know that really one of the major drivers of the power usage at data centers is cooling. Like that's a big part of why they need to use so much power. I think there's been a lot of innovation there. It seems like, there are some new ideas on how to do this more efficiently. I would expect and hope to see further innovation, but as the question pointed out, climate's getting warmer. And what are we going to need to do is that just going to exacerbate more need for cooling and more energy use and kind of a spiral? It's a good question. I would love to be on a webinar or sit down with someone who really knows the technical nuts and bolts of how these things operate. That's not me. But I think it's what I have observed and what I is that a lot of the projections, like I hope and I expect to see more innovation over time in this area so that the type of energy efficiency gains we've seen in other sectors, we're also going to see with data centers. And we're going to hopefully be able to do more compute with less power and avoid the sort of worst impacts and projections that, you see on the charts I shared earlier with the really spiky high load growth forecasts. If we can continue doing more with less and we can encourage innovation in this sector, I think um, we'll all be better off. And I hope that that happens.
I think we'll do this maybe as a last question. And I think like a little bit related to the permitting piece and how the state deals with this. So Zach had asked a question about the permitting process, the consent process. Like, is there a new permitting process? Um, and then Kelly is asking a question about the race for data centers creating a similar phenomenon to Amazon. So, I mean, what's your answer, Brad, with the ability to, um, you know, if we're not imposing great environmental regulations here, and we're thinking about environmental justice communities and diesel generators at these facilities, then they're going into Indiana where they're not thinking about it as all at all. So, what's your thought in terms of that state race to the bottom, but um, our desire to ensure that we're protecting the environment?
Yeah, I love that question, Jen, and I think the question goes to really this idea of sometimes we call it leakage for or race to the bottom, right? If Illinois is really focused on creating strong regulation, does that just push data center development into neighboring states that might not have protections and we end up in a worse place as a planet? Um, it's a real concern. Um, my hope, is that states like Illinois can um, develop policies that balance um, that provide very strong, clear regulation and protection. And as the flip side of that coin would be provide a sort of a clear investment path for the types of companies that are responsible and are going to develop in a clean, responsible way. Um, Create a race to the top instead of a race to the bottom. I think that's possible. And I think there's ways in which, you think about a company that's looking to get electric service from ComEd, for example. There's 26, 28 gigawatts of new load stuck in this queue that ComEd will never be able to serve that much. What if you're a company that's a responsible company with a really good plan for securing clean energy and you're going to do a bunch of distributed generation and storage, you've got load flexibility, you're thinking about a campus where you can secure clean power. What distinguishes you right now from a speculator that's just going to rely on fossil or just try to secure power from the market? Nothing. From ComEd's perspective right now, there's nothing to distinguish the good from the bad. We need policies that will identify protections and targets for clean energy, for the environment, for clean air and clean water. And then for companies that can meet them, they have a path to development. They are selected for um, they're able to get onto the grid faster. This kind of speed to grid idea. Because right now, that's the one thing all of these companies want. They bottleneck for development is getting onto the grid as fast as they can. And they're very challenged right now. So if we can strike that balance in Illinois, strong, clear, transparent environmental protection, and then as a result of that, speed to grid, providing a pathway for investment in the state in a clear, transparent way, I think we create that race to the top. And I hope that those are the kind of policies that the state considers in the year ahead.
That was a great way to end this, and that is our hope and what we want to keep working on. So thank you. And again, we recorded this and we also will have the slides available Hannah put the link for CLE credit. But just thank you so much, Brad. That was incredibly informative, and I'm glad to have that information recorded. So we'll send it out. And for those of you getting CLE, I think our next set is June 30th on the Future of Gas workshop. So we're going real heavily on energy law this year. So thanks for joining us. Okay,
Thank you,
thanks. Bye,
Jen.
Brad.
It's a
Thank you so
pleasure.
much.